Hey everybody, another video for you. Thank you as always for all of the support. I am going to try to return to my usual kind of format for how I do these videos in this one. And what I mean by that is I'm going to try to highlight a number of stories and angles on situation in Russia and Ukraine and more broadly in some geopolitical context. And I'm trying to do so by highlighting stories that may have been missed, but also by doing so from an explicitly Marxist perspective, from a materialist, analytical perspective. I think that even on the left, maybe especially on the left, we find that those people who use YouTube and other such mediums to get out their political analysis are quite often just posturing and role playing as Marxists. They don't actually do any Marxist analysis at all. And in fact, one would be quite justified in questioning whether they are in fact Marxists or if that's just the kind of thing that they like to pretend to be. In any event, I want to do a little bit of economic analysis on the situation in Russia, what we can glean from some of the official statistics, maybe what's missing from some of those official statistics, and how we view Russia here, what, 16 months or so into this disastrous war. Now, again, if you haven't been following me and my work all throughout, these 14, 16 months, well, then you may not realize this, but, I was trying to highlight a lot of these economic issues early on because it was clear to me that Russia was going to be sort of reaping what it sowed, that is to say, economically suffering long-term negative effects because of what I described from the very beginning as Putin's world historic disastrous blunder. And I still believe, quite obviously, that it was one of the great strategic blunders of modern times, certainly up there with, Hitler's two-front war and Napoleon's invasion of Russia and, other such disastrous adventures. But in any event, the economic side of this is important. Now, I will say, though, that for those of us who have been, fiercely critical of Russia, Putin, everything that they've been doing and have been highlighting a lot of these issues, at the same time, there is a tendency among many to kind of see doomsday, see a Russian apocalypse in every data point, in every new statistic that comes out, especially in the early days of this conflict. There definitely was that tendency. And I tried to caution against that. And hopefully I wasn't susceptible to that myself. But in any event, I say that only because when we look at the economic data today, we have to keep in mind two things. One, that this is all in the context of this war and the geopolitical international upheaval that it has caused, but also that the economic situation is tenuous, but also stable, right? Russia is not a society that is necessarily going to collapse tomorrow, even as the economy takes a downturn, which it clearly is, as I'm going to describe. So, for those people who, are on the edge of their seats, waiting for the ever present collapse of Putin that just doesn't ever quite seem to come, well, unfortunately, the economic indicators are not going to be staggering enough to satisfy you. But if you're somebody that wants the real deal, wants to understand what's going on, let's dive into this. All right, enough bloviating on all of that. Let's jump into some of the economic numbers. And by the way, before we do, I'll just quickly say that after I'm done going through some of the situation in Russia, I'm going to talk about a number of other issues, including international things. I'm going to jump around on a few other things. So make sure you stay to the very end, even if you're bored with economics. All right, let's look at very interesting summary and some notes from Sergei Alexashenko. This was in his Substack, dated May 6, 2023. This is going over the official statistics and summary that was released by Rosstat, the Russian statistical agency. Again, we have to keep in mind that to some degree, we have to have a little bit of a, take these things with a grain of salt, as it were, that we have to understand that Russia's official statistics themselves are potentially greatly massaged, that there are questions about just how reliable they are, questions about the selectivity with which certain statistics are released and others suppressed, and so forth. But we do also acknowledge that this is pretty much the best data that we have that we can look at, short of, some of these other cobbled together, economic estimates done at Yale and some of these other places. But the Russian official statistical agency is a good place to start. So taking a look at just the various sectors, I'm going to try to highlight the ones in the red first, the declining sectors, and then we'll talk about those that are in the black, because again, as I said, it's not all negative. So let's begin with gas production. Gas production continuing on its steady decline. Gas production in Q1 of 2023, which is the latest data that's analyzed in these Rostat summary. Gas production in Russia fell by 14% in Q1 of 2023. That would be January through March of this year. Gazprom specifically, its production falling by 17.5% compared to last year. Now, again, we should keep in mind that compared to last year, you're comparing Q1 of 23 to Q1 of 22. And forgive me for those people in the corporate world for whom that's obvious, but maybe not everybody. You compare, the quarter of 2023 to its corresponding quarter in the prior year. And of course, Q1 of 2022 for Russia was a period of extreme upheaval. That was, of course, when the beginning of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, or maybe Russia's second invasion of Ukraine, depending on how you look at it. In any event, the statistics of Q1 of 2022 are going to be to some degree difficult to extrapolate from. But needless to say, it's still a benchmark, and it is a significant decline of 17.5%. The decline in gas production, according to experts, seems to be expected to continue for the next several months. Now, there's a couple of aspects to that, but I'm going to hold off because I want to talk about oil as well, and maybe we could combine the oil and gas components here. Looking at oil production in Russia decreasing by 2.5% in Q1 of 2023. Again, a decrease, but a smaller one. Now, Deputy Prime Minister Novak announcing that Russia has reduced its oil production by about 500,000 barrels per day in April compared to February. That seems to jive with roughly that 2.5% or so decline. So it seems here we can, in a sense, cross-check these official data with some of the public statements from high-ranking officials, and it does seem to be more or less accurate. Now, the reason I wanted to highlight that point, though, is because all of these questions about oil really need to be understood against the backdrop of the price cap. The price cap that is being imposed by the G7 countries against Russia's oil exports specifically. Now, that includes, and I did a video about this many months ago now. You'd probably have to go back and find that. But that includes not only the oil itself, but it includes the various products, including pipeline servicing products and various other, myriad products that come out of oil production that I can't even begin to rattle off the top of my head right this moment. But, needless to say, it is economically very significant for Russia. And one would, I guess, question whether the reduction in Russian oil production, this seemingly steady reduction, is potentially in anticipation of these price caps, which are going to cut into Russia's oil exports. Now, on the gas side of this, of course, Russia has long had this dominant position in gas in Europe. As Europe shifts further away from Russia, Russia would like to sort of present the idea that it is simply shifting those gas exports away from Europe and towards Asia, when in fact it's a lot more complicated than that. Well, I don't know if I'm going to talk about it in this video, but maybe in another video, I'm going to talk about the disastrous attempts by Russia in the liquefied natural gas sector, especially in the Far East. There was long going to be talk of the great Russian liquefied natural gas utopia in, eastern Siberia that, of course, is a pipe dream at best. Anyway, I don't want to digress now. Looking at the energy sector, we're talking about gas in decline, major decline, oil in decline. We're talking about coal also declining. Coal production is declining significantly due especially to the embargo that's been imposed by Europe. Now, of course, for those of us who have even an ounce of humanity and an ounce of care for the environment and climate change and all sorts of other related issues, any coal that isn't being sold on the world market is better, of course. But from a purely economic perspective, this hurts Russia. Certainly. Let's not pretend like there isn't a lot of coal energy still being used in the world today. So coal production is declining. And the Russians, again, as I kind of mentioned with the gas, but especially in regard to coal, the Russians would like to make you believe that, well, we can't sell this coal to these European countries anymore. We'll simply sell it to Asia. But in fact, if you look at the numbers and you look at the steep decline in coal production, you can see quite clearly that what's already been reported in various outlets is true, that Russia has diverted some of its coal to Asian buyers in particular, but not all. In other words, you can't just reorient all of those exports immediately to Asia. Quite frankly, you can't just make up buyers. The buyers have to be there. And if the buyers aren't there and the logistics aren't there, the coal doesn't get sold. Looking at housing and investment, housing and investment in housing construction also on a significant decline. You have statistics showing housing and investment construction industry declining year on year. The decline began in the last quarter of 2021 and throughout 2022. Excuse me, no, it began in the last quarter of 2022 and it's continued through the first quarter of 2023, which is interesting because that contradicts directly what Vice Premier Husnulin had reported to Putin about saying that the housing construction industry was growing. Now, the caveat I would pose here, and the data is not clear because, again, this is Russian statistical, bureau data that doesn't necessarily give you all the granular details. But I would be interested to know just how much of the investment in housing construction is happening inside of Russia proper versus potentially investment in housing construction and or reconstruction in the Russian occupied Donetsk, Lugansk, and so forth. Would be interesting to know. I actually don't know what I would expect. But in any event, those are some of the key sectors where you're seeing major decline. Again, energy, of course, for a country like Russia, decline in the energy sector is that's a killer. All right, but it's not all negative for the Russian economy. Iron ore production is seeing a slight uptick. You have iron ore slightly recovering. A lot of that is due to, and this is going to be a running theme, a lot of that is due to the Russian war effort, to moving to building defensive structures in Ukraine, to supplying the Russian military, etc. Iron ore concentrate production decreased by about 6.5% compared to its peak decline of 10% in Q3 of 2020. Now, I don't really know what to make of that other than the decline has been ongoing for 2.5 years. So presumably, the war hasn't really impacted that trend. Metal construction production is increasing. You also have a significant increase, of course, again, due to the war. Now, the contradictory statistics in the construction material production, this is kind of interesting because on the one hand, they're saying, well, we're doing great and we're providing for the military and yada yada yada, and at the same time, a sharp decline in basically all sectors except for concrete production. I don't know. What do you make of that? Again, presumably it's as a result of the, arming of the military. Military production, I keep mentioning, it seems to be the driving element, and that's going to be one of the takeaways of the analysis of these numbers here. Military production is on the rise. The Rostat numbers don't give detailed information about military production, but based on what we can see, the data shows a significant increase in military production and of course, attendant industries, the production of furniture, to equip soldiers, soldiers' barracks, etc. All right. Now, I want to now talk about the numbers, okay? Because I think the numbers here are going to be very important. And let me move this window over here. I'm going to narrate to myself because I like to be extremely annoying as I try to do this. All right. Russian spending on this war. You could talk about all of the various sectors, all the various industries, absolutely. But Russian spending on the war, ultimately, it's the bottom line here. Russia has spent at least 5 trillion rubles in the last 14 months on this war, which is equivalent to roughly 34,500 rubles per Russian citizen and 55% of the average monthly salary. Okay, now I probably should have done a rubles to dollars conversion here. So let me do that right now. Rubles to dollars. Let's see exactly how much? 5 trillion. So 5 trillion rubles. Let's see. That's 5 million, 5 billion, and 5 trillion. So what is that? That's 65 billion dollars, give or take 65.2 billion dollars. Um for an economy the size of Russia's, that is absolutely staggering. What did I say? 65 billion. Let's see. Just if I could just Google very quickly, Russian GDP. So I said 65 billion Russian GDP. Of course, it's not going to come up very quickly for me. This is where I should probably be using ChatGPT, huh? Well, anyway, it's a significant amount of Russia's total GDP, which I'm sure the moment I stop looking for it, I will find it. Anyway, whatever. I'm not going to bother with that at the moment. The point being, $65 billion is a massive amount, a huge portion of the total Russian economy, or rather the total Russian budget. And quite frankly, these are kind of sunk costs, right? There's not necessarily, I mean, it's lining the pockets of construction firms, it's lining the pockets of, speculators and real estate types and so forth. But for the average Russian citizen, it's not really beneficial at all. And in fact, if anything, it's a tremendous drain on the average Russian, not only if you take a sort of average per citizen, but also if you think about all of the critical services that are not going to be funded because of this war, funding for university education, primary education, secondary education, funding for medical facilities, funding for countless social programs, infrastructure projects, and so forth, right? All of this is kind of going to be, I don't, if not totally fall by the wayside, then certainly going to be under represented in Russian, economic budget priorities. In any event, uh, the war expenses that are shown by the statistical agencies, statistical bureau, it's unreliable because it's incomplete, right? So some of that could be because some of this information is classified. The Russian government has not declassified it. Some of that could also be because of the not so subtle pressures of Russian political elites basically demanding that things don't get too embarrassing in the data. All right. So the lack of transparency is a big problem. The lack of thought and foresight over the long-term consequences of this spending. Bottom line is the war effort will chug along while Russia's economy continues to slide, even while those economic indicators may look stable and relatively okay. You still have life for the average Russian citizen getting worse and worse and worse. That's what, as Boris Kagarlitsky explained to me when I interviewed him a number of months ago, you were poor before the war started. You're even poorer since the war began, and you will be even poorer moving into the future. That is the bleak but real outlook for most Russian working people. All right. So, first quarter of 2023 takeaway, very difficult to analyze. If you look at, again, as I mentioned, first quarter of 2023 versus its analog of 2022, tough to make a comparison because Q1 2022 is the beginning of the war. There are some signs that the Russian economy is recovering. To the extent to which it's recovering is debatable. You do have certain industries rebounding, others still in decline. I suppose one could say that it remains to be seen, but quite frankly, I think this is the trend that's going to continue. You're going to see Russia's economy continue to steadily decline, even while exhibiting a lot of this kind of stability. And to be honest, we should be fair, I guess, to say that Russia's economy has proven somewhat resilient, certainly resilient in the face of overwhelming economic warfare being waged by the United States and its European allies. I mean, the United States has pretty much declared, I mean, all but declared war on Russia in the form of economic warfare, not in the actual military space, where actually the United States has been much more cautious, I think, than many of us would have expected. All right. Can't digress now. Let's keep moving. I'm already past the 20-minute mark. My goodness. Let's talk a little bit about the economic side of the occupation, because this is also very, very important as well. You have a federal the federal budget sending 410 billion rubles, 410 billion rubles, which is about 5.1 billion dollars, to the occupied territories in Ukraine. Okay, so now these these uh these billions that are being transferred to these occupied territories, number one, just remember, this is money that's not going to other regions inside of the Russian Federation. So you already have that tension going on. But then separate from that, these are transfers. We have to say these are like grants. They're transfers directly to the balance sheets of these regions. These are different from subsidies. They're different from direct funding for projects, right? This is like, I don't know, like wire transferring massive amounts of money directly to the to the authorities that you've just installed. Now, obviously, I don't have to explain the gaping holes just waiting for corruption, to uh, expose all of those kind of obvious ways in which there's going to be skimming off the top and all of this other stuff. This is obvious, right? But separate from that, there's also this question about where all of the money is going and what it's going for. So the transfers seem to be like mostly for salaries, paying of civil servants and things like that, which makes sense if you want to avoid social breakdown. Again, as I've done videos on Donetsk and Lugansk, specifically, you don't have functioning republics there, let alone people's republics, but they're not even functioning republics. These are basically essentially collapsed regions that are operated as, something akin to like a mafia gangster state crossed with sort of a warlord like mentality. It's a hellish situation in Donetsk and Lugansk, right? And these places are not exactly ripe with law-abiding, tax-paying citizens, right? So it's not like you can just collect tax revenue and use that to fund the government in the way that a normal functioning state would. So the central government in Moscow has to transfer massive amounts of money. Now, the transfers are making more, up to roughly 90% of the total budgets of the occupied territories. So again, the Donetsk People's Republic, quote unquote, becomes a greater burden on the federal budget even than Crimea, which is interesting considering how strategically vital Crimea is versus how not strategically vital Donetsk is. Now, why do I say this? Because I'm saying that Crimea is Russia and Donetsk isn't? No, I'm saying this because I think we can, if we look at the actual data, we can begin to see what I've been saying all along, that Putin really fucked himself here, right? That he walked into an obvious quagmire in eastern Ukraine, one that he now desperately has to keep throwing money at, knowing that the money is not going to go anywhere but into the pockets of, corrupt bureaucrats and so forth, right? Now he has to explain to the Russian people why they're sinking all that money into Donetsk. Now, of course, the propaganda system and so forth, it can, prop up support for Putin's talking points, but quietly and amongst themselves, conversations happen in Russia being like, what are you fucking kidding me? How much we're spending on Donetsk versus the fact that my kid can't get, school textbooks or whatever it might be. In any event, Crimea had been the most subsidized region in Russia after its annexation in 2014. Not so anymore. Okay, now you also have the Duma in Russia creating a free economic zone, or actually, they're looking at a law to create a free economic zone in the occupied territories. But basically, what is a free economic zone in the occupied Donetsk and Lugansk? It means very little. What it basically means is well-connected, Kremlin-connected Russian capitalists are going to be able to go in there with their investment contracts, and they're going to be able to scoop up massive profits. That's what it means, more or less. So the money that's going to the republics, to put it in perspective, it's slightly under the budget, the 2022 entire budget of Tatarstan, which is one of Russia's wealthiest regions. Now, the key point here is that despite the fact that we've already said 410 billion rubles, that doesn't even cover all of it, because you still have a tremendous amount of funds, both direct and indirect support, being channeled to the occupied territories. And by the way, I should add, it's not only being channeled into those territories, it's also being extracted from those territories. And I've talked a lot about, how this kind of grand scale money laundering operation has been working, basically to extract capital out of, both capital in terms of money, but capital also in terms of capital goods, out of Ukraine, out of Donetsk and Lugansk, and funneling it into Russian oligarch hands. So, in any event, that is continuing to happen. Money is, of course, going to be skimmed off the top, and that's how it goes in Russia. Okay, let's move on. Speaking of economic issues, let's see. Am I still recording? I hope I am. Yes. Speaking of economic issues, let's talk very quickly about Russian interest rates. The Central Bank of Russia has announced that it's keeping the key interest rate at 7.5% for the fifth time in a row at its board of directors meeting last Friday. So bottom line is, the bank more or less is saying that given the geopolitical tensions, given Russia's position vis-a-vis Ukraine, vis-a-vis sanctions and everything else, we still see in Russia a tremendous pressure towards pro-inflationary reactions. So, in other words, there isn't any lowering of interest rates. So what does this mean? This means that while inflation may remain in check, life is still very difficult for ordinary Russian citizens, right? And Nabulina, who is the head of the central bank, who is still regarded, was, and I presume still is to some degree, regarded very highly in economic, and monetary policy circles in Europe. Nabulina said that, quote, let's see, what are her key quotes? Geopolitical tensions are affecting foreign trade terms, quote, significant shortages of labor forces in certain industries, and, quote, high and unanchored inflation expectations. Okay, so the bottom line is that they're expecting to tamp down inflation, to keep inflation below 7%. That was the original projection. The 2022 inflation rate in Russia was allegedly 11.9%. Now, I say allegedly intentionally, because we have had many reports. I've already mentioned some of them, but we have had many reports of the Kremlin basically not so subtly hinting to the central bank and to other economic, monetary policy agencies that, look, you need to put a positive spin on these things. You cannot allow people to think that the Russian economy is really in dire straits when in fact it is. Okay, so Bloomberg had reported in February that Kremlin officials were pressuring the bank to, quote, be more upbeat about the state of the economy and to, quote, hint about a rate decrease later this year. Well, that's not happening anytime soon, at least not now. So if you look at the key rate forecast, it allows for potentially a rate decrease, but the rate decrease ain't coming anytime in the next couple of months. So again, what does this mean? You do have a degree of stability in the Russian economy. Again, it's not collapsing. At the same time, between all of the sanctions and everything else, and now the consistently high interest rate, which, by the way, was originally supposed to be a very temporary measure when it was extraordinarily high at 20%. They brought it down to a more reasonable level, but try buying a home in Russia. All right. So let's move on. I want to running out of time, so let me just quickly run through several stories. Zelensky, Ukrainian President Zelensky, had his call with Xi Jinping. Let's see. Let me see. Oh, by the way, I'm recording this on a different recording platform that allows me to do images, and so, isn't that exciting? We shall see. All right, here it is. Let's see if I got it. There it is. Okay, I think we're all seeing that. Vladimir Zelensky had a call with Chinese Premier Xi Jinping. Did I say premier president? Whatever. I had a long and meaningful phone call with President Xi Jinping. I believe that this call, as well as the appointment of Ukraine's ambassador to China, will give a powerful impetus to the development of our bilateral relations. Well, I mean, okay, there's not much there, of course, but what do we read into this? Well, the first thing I think that we take away from this is that Kiev, not Beijing, Kiev initiated this call. This reaching out directly to Beijing. This is the first time this has happened since the war began, since Beijing, quite in my opinion, preposterously positioned itself shoulder to shoulder with Russia, which was a disastrous mistake that the Chinese made, that I think many intelligent Chinese voices have been, saying all along was a terrible mistake. But anyway, the Ukrainians are the ones who reached out. And this then raises a very interesting question. Why? Zelensky has taken essentially, 16 months to reach out to the Chinese. He's counted on the support of the Europeans, the support of the Americans, the support of the various allies around the world, Japanese and Australians and others. Okay. But why now to China? I mean, I think that we could say a number of different things. One, of course, being that there are very practical concerns inside of Ukraine, concerns about morale, concerns about materiel, concerns about its ability to continue prosecuting a war after whatever counteroffensive they're planning, to unveil. All of these concerns, I think, are probably part of it. I would take a slightly different angle on it and say that I would think that this is actually, to some degree, the beginning of Ukraine hedging against what might come in the United States in 2024. Because again, Biden is a very insecure president. There's no guarantee that Biden or anybody representing the Democrats, which at this point seems like all but certainty is going to be Biden, is going to win the presidency. And whether that means a return of Donald Trump or some other Republican like a Ron DeSantis, who himself is kind of waffled on the question of where he stands vis-a-vis Ukraine. Is it, a national security and international priority, or is it a territorial dispute between Russia and Ukraine that you don't want to be involved in? DeSantis tries to play both sides, tries to walk the fence between the hardcore Trumpists and the neocon types, but at the end of the day, it's fairly clear that whatever creature comes out of the Republican Party, it's going to represent a significant change vis-a-vis Ukraine. Now, whether or not that means that it means US support goes away. I don't think so. However, I think it's fairly clear that the Ukrainians, quite rightly, want to hedge their bets. And I think that reaching out to China is probably one way to do that, because if you can begin to move the Chinese a little bit, move them a little bit out of Russia's corner and a little bit closer to the center, that would be a win for Ukraine. And that would certainly give them leverage, both leverage against the United States to the extent that they might need that, but also leverage against the Russians, because if the Ukrainians and the Chinese strike up a special relationship, well, then maybe that phone call to Putin is just a little bit easier. Okay. Let's move on to the discovery of a mass grave. Oh, that's always a fun story. Normally, it's hellish to even consider, because when I talk about mass graves here on these videos, it's usually in places like Bucha or Izium, or in Mali, or in Mexico, or wherever, or indigenous mass graves in Canada, or whatever it might be. And it's always horrible. In this case, although mass graves are always horrible, in this case, I'm talking about the scum Wagner mercenaries that have been killed in action and secretly buried. So it's slightly less distasteful. Well, whatever. You get the idea. In Novosibirsk, in the Novosibirsk region of Russia, reporters have found a previously unreported mass burial site. Now, I said mass grave. I think we should be clear. This is not like a mass grave where it's like a big pit with bodies in it. This is a previously undiscovered cemetery, essentially, that is seemingly exclusively dedicated to Wagner fighters, or largely populated by Wagner mercenaries. The reporters have done some preliminary investigation. They believe there to be upwards of 200 dead buried there. Now, my question is, and the reason I bring it up is, how many of these cemeteries do you think there are? How many, all spread out all over Russia and maybe beyond the borders of Russia? Presumably there's, I don't know, 10, 20, dozens, scores of such cemeteries, comprising thousands, tens of thousands of dead. I mean, official estimates ranging from 10 to 20,000 just on the Wagner side alone. Very interesting to think about the scale of those losses. And that's kind of, keep that in your mind when you see that video of Prigozhin standing there in front of a pile of corpses and he's blaming Defense Minister Shoigu for it, right? Because Wagner men are getting slaughtered. There's no question about that. So yeah, so in any event, mass grave discovered in Novosibirsk, or mass burial site discovered in Novosibirsk. Anyway, what else can I say about that? All right, let's move on. I want to talk a little bit about what I would call a quiet war that's going on in Crimea. There's a lot of interesting partisan activity happening over there. We've had several attacks in Crimea just in the last several days. Let's see if I can get the correct graphics up there. Okay, so we had Sevastopol, which is one of the main cities in Crimea. Of course, the Russian Black Sea Fleet, etc. Sevastopol being attacked by drones. Earlier the same day, there were reports of air defense fire and air sirens in the town of Yevpatoria, which is also in Crimea. And on April 29th, we had, so that was, let's see, this is all within 3 days of each other. On April 29th, you had an oil depot at Kozacha Bay in Sevastopol set on fire. Let's see if I have that. There it is. And this was, again, attributed to a drone attack. So now there's a lot of discussion about whether or not these various attacks that have been happening within Crimea, whether they represent sort of the opening stages, the opening salvo of the Ukrainian counteroffensive, which many people have predicted was going to include a direct assault on Crimea. I don't buy it, but some kind of an attack on Crimea. But there are two ways of looking at this. Are these drone attacks designed to accomplish a military objective? Maybe. But I also think they accomplish a very clear propaganda function, and that is to create a kind of social destabilization in Crimea, inside of Russia proper. Okay, and force the Russians to contingency plan, as we saw, for instance, with the cutting of traffic on the bridge in Crimea a number of days ago. Measures that the Russians are forced to take in advance of the May 9th Victory Day celebrations, etc. It's clear that this partisan activity happening in Crimea. Well, I shouldn't say partisan activity. Actually, I'm mixing two different things. These would be drones from Ukraine attacking Crimea. Now, let me switch. I don't know why it's weird. Anyway, forget it. Now let me switch over to the sabotage inside of Russia. I was talking about Crimea. I think I misspoke. Sabotage inside of Russia by partisan activity. That is what I want to talk about now. Two freight train derailments within the same week in the same region, in the region of Bryansk on the border with Ukraine. A train carrying oil products derailed Monday in western Bryansk near the town of Unecha, close to the Ukrainian border. No casualties, 7 wagons derailed, and the locomotive caught on fire. Very interesting how this just keeps happening. um, Let's see. Another derailment, only 2 kilometers outside the city of Bryansk. 20 wagons derailed, no casualties. Bryansk governor Alexander Bogomaz attributed both derailments to, quote, unidentified explosive devices, while Russian railways blamed, quote, the intervention of unauthorized persons. Bottom line is clearly Russian partisan activity, clearly having an impact, clearly making a difference in terms of quite literally attacking and undermining Russian rail infrastructure, which is critical, especially along the border for logistics and so forth. So, in any event, there's a lot more that I really need to talk about. I have stuff prepared to talk about Burkina Faso and what's going on in West Africa with regard to Russia, but I am out of time. It is midnight. I need to get some rest. We're going to leave it there. Thank you, as always, for the support. If you are not following me and supporting me on Patreon, please consider doing that. Patreon.com/Eric Draitser is the place to go. You have tons of videos like this. Some of them are available for free to everybody. Some of them are only for subscribers. Be one of those people. Thank you so much. Talk to you again next time.